The lead B-29 superfortress, carrying Major General Curtis LeMay's Pathfinder crews, crossed the Japanese coastline south of Tokyo shortly after midnight on March 10, 1945, flying at only 5,000 feet altitude, rather than the 25,000 to 30,000 feet that B-29s normally operated at when attacking Japanese cities. The crew had removed most of their defensive armament to save weight, carrying only tail guns and depending on darkness and the element of surprise to protect them from Japanese night fighters that might intercept. The bomb bay held not the high explosive bombs that previous raids had employed, but rather clusters of incendiary bombs, each cluster containing dozens of smaller bomblets filled with jellied gasoline that would scatter across wide areas when released and ignite whatever they touched. LeMay, commanding the WWII Bomber Command from his headquarters on Guam, had made the decision to completely change American strategic bombing tactics against Japan based on his assessment that high-altitude precision bombing during daylight was achieving minimal results and that the losses to Japanese fighters in anti-aircraft fire were unsustainable. The switch to low-altitude nighttime incendiary attacks represented an enormous gamble because it contradicted established doctrine and because failure would likely end LeMay's career regardless of his previous successes, commanding bomber operations in Europe and China. But LeMay believed with growing certainty that Japanese cities constructed primarily from wood and paper could be destroyed through massed incendiary attacks that would create firestorms consuming entire urban districts. The Pathfinder aircraft released their incendiaries over predetermined target points in Tokyo's Shitamachi district, the densely populated working-class neighborhoods in the eastern part of the city, where wooden houses and small workshops were packed so tightly together that individual structures often shared walls. The incendiaries ignited immediately upon hitting buildings or streets, starting hundreds of individual fires that would soon merge into a conflagration that would consume 16 square miles of urban area before dawn. Within minutes, the main force of approximately 300 B-29s began arriving over Tokyo in a stream formation, each aircraft attacking individually rather than in the tight defensive formations that daylight bombing required, dropping their incendiaries from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. The crews of the following B-29s could see the fires started by the Pathfinders from dozens of miles away, orange and red glows illuminating the night sky and providing navigation points more reliable than any radio beacon. As the main force arrived and began dropping their loads, the individual fires merged into larger conflagrations that generated their own weather, creating powerful updrafts that tossed the heavy bombers around like leaves in a storm. Crews reported their aircraft being lifted thousands of feet by rising columns of superheated air, then dropped suddenly as they passed through the thermals. The smell of burning wood, burning flesh, and smoke penetrated the sealed aircraft cabins despite the altitude, sickening crew members who understood that the smell came from the city burning below them and from the people dying in the flames. The fires spread with terrifying speed through neighborhoods where houses built primarily from wood and paper were separated by narrow streets and alleys that provided corridors for flames to jump from building to building. The wind that night, blowing at approximately 30 miles per hour, transformed individual fires into a moving wall of flame that advanced faster than people could run, trapping entire neighborhoods between the fire and the Sumida River that formed a barrier preventing escape to the east. Residents who had survived previous American bombing raids and who had practiced air defense drills found that nothing in their experience or training had prepared them for the reality of a firestorm consuming their neighborhoods with such speed and intensity that escape was often impossible. The Japanese civil defense system that had been established during earlier years of the war called for residents to remain in their neighborhoods and fight fires using bucket brigades, hand pumps, and sand to smother flames. This doctrine had worked reasonably well against small fires started by individual bombs or by accidents, but it was completely inadequate for the firestorm that developed on March 10th, where thousands of fires merged into conflagrations that no amount of bucket brigades or hand pumps could possibly control. Residents who attempted to follow civil defense doctrine and fight fires in their neighborhoods often died when the fires they were fighting suddenly intensified and trapped them, or when the oxygen in the air was consumed by flames, creating an atmosphere that couldn't support human life. Those who recognized quickly that fighting the fires was futile and who began evacuating immediately had the best chance of survival, though even early evacuation did not guarantee safety given how rapidly the fires spread and how limited the escape routes were from densely populated neighborhoods. Families fled carrying whatever possessions they could grab, often losing each other in the chaos and smoke, searching desperately for routes away from the advancing flames. The main evacuation routes, the bridges crossing the Sumida River, and the few wide streets that provided paths through the burning districts, became choked with refugees trying to escape, creating crowds so dense that movement became nearly impossible. The bridges became death traps when fires reached both ends simultaneously, trapping thousands of people on the spans with no escape as flames approached from both directions and as the intense heat made the bridge surfaces too hot to stand on. Some jumped into the river to escape the flames, but the Sumida was only partially tidal at that point, and the water was shallow in many areas, forcing people who jumped to wade through mud while others fell on top of them, creating piles of bodies in the river that survivors described with horror decades later. Those who managed to reach deeper water faced different dangers from the cold temperature that caused hypothermia and from the crush of people all seeking the same refuge from flames. The parks and open spaces that Tokyo's city planners had incorporated into the urban layout, specifically to serve as fire breaks and refuges during disasters, became killing grounds when superheated air from the surrounding fires turned them into ovens that roasted people who had sought safety there. Sumida Park and other open areas that should have provided refuge from flames instead became places where thousands died from heat exposure and from oxygen depletion as the fires consumed all available oxygen in the air. Bodies found in these parks after the fires subsided showed no burns but had clearly died from breathing superheated air that seared lungs or from suffocation when oxygen levels dropped below what human metabolism required. The fire department resources that Tokyo possessed were completely overwhelmed within the first hour of the attack, when hundreds of fires burning simultaneously exceeded the capacity of available firefighting equipment and personnel by factors of 10 or 20. Fire trucks attempting to reach burning areas found streets blocked by rubble from collapsed buildings, by crowds of fleeing refugees, and sometimes by fires that had already spread across the streets, making passage impossible. Water pressure in the mains dropped as multiple fires drew from the system simultaneously, and as damaged pipes leaked water onto streets rather than delivering it to fire hoses. Firefighters who managed to reach fires with equipment found that their hoses and pumps were useless against conflagrations that were consuming entire city blocks and that could not be fought by conventional means. The police and civil defense organizations that were supposed to coordinate evacuation and provide aid to affected residents found themselves as helpless as the civilians they were supposed to protect. Police stations burned along with the neighborhoods they served. Civil defense volunteers who had trained for months to respond to air attacks were killed along with the residents they were supposed to help. The entire civil defense system, designed based on assumptions about how air attacks would develop and about what resources would be available to respond, simply collapsed when confronted with a disaster that exceeded its design parameters by such enormous margins that nothing it had prepared for was relevant to the actual situation. The firestorm reached its peak intensity between 0200 and 0400 hours on March 10th, when the fires that had started after midnight had merged into a single conflagration, consuming approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo's most densely populated districts. The temperatures at ground level in the burning areas exceeded 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and to cause spontaneous combustion of materials that normally required direct flame contact to ignite. The winds generated by the fire itself, created by hot air rising and cooler air rushing in to replace it, reached speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, turning the fire into a self-sustaining phenomenon that would continue burning until it had consumed everything flammable in its path, or until it reached barriers like rivers or extremely wide streets that it could not cross. The human toll during those peak hours was catastrophic, beyond what any Japanese officials had imagined possible when they had planned for air defense and civil protection. People died by the thousands every hour through multiple mechanisms, including direct burning, heat exposure, smoke inhalation, oxygen depletion, crushing in crowds attempting to evacuate, drowning in the river or in water reservoirs where they sought refuge, and from the collapse of buildings and structures weakened by fire. The exact number who died would never be determined with precision, because entire families were killed, leaving no survivors to report their deaths, and because many bodies were completely consumed by the fires, leaving no remains to count or identify. The B-29 crews completing their bombing runs and turning back toward their bases in the Mariana Islands could see Tokyo burning from over 150 miles away, the glow from the fires visible on the horizon long after the city itself had disappeared below the curvature of the earth. Some crew members expressed horror at what they had participated in, understanding that the fires they had started were killing civilians by the thousands. Others rationalized the attack as necessary to end the war and to save American lives that would be lost in an invasion of Japan, repeating the justifications that commanders had provided during briefings. Most simply tried not to think too much about what was happening below them, focusing on their jobs and on returning safely to base, rather than dwelling on the human consequences of their mission. General LeMay, receiving reports throughout the night about the attack's progress and about the massive fires visible from the B-29's, felt satisfaction that his tactical gamble had succeeded in achieving the kind of devastating results that high-altitude precision bombing had never produced. He understood that he had ordered an operation that was killing enormous numbers of civilians, but he believed the deaths were justified by the strategic necessity of ending the war as quickly as possible, and by the calculation that destroying Japanese industrial capacity and breaking civilian morale would save more lives ultimately than would be lost in the firebombing. LeMay would later state that if the United States had lost the war, he would likely have been tried as a war criminal for ordering the Tokyo firebombing, an acknowledgement that he understood the moral ambiguity of what he had done while believing it was necessary nonetheless. Dawn on March 10th revealed devastation that shocked even those who had witnessed the fires during the night. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been completely destroyed, an area larger than what had been destroyed by any previous bombing raid on any city anywhere in the world. Approximately 267,000 buildings had been burned to the ground or damaged beyond repair, leaving approximately 1 million residents homeless. The death toll was estimated at approximately 100,000 people killed in a single night, more than had died in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima that would occur 5 months later, making Operation Meetinghouse as the Tokyo firebombing raid was officially designated the single most destructive air attack in human history, measured by deaths and destruction in a single event. The bodies of the dead were found in circumstances that revealed the terror and desperation of their final moments. Families died together in shelters that became ovens when surrounded by fires. Parents were found clutching children they had tried to protect but could not save from heat or smoke. Some bodies showed evidence of people who had tried to dig into the ground to escape the heat, clawing at earth with their hands until they died from smoke inhalation or heat exposure. Others died in crowds where the density of people was so great that they suffocated from being crushed against others while the crowd tried to move. The Sumida River contained thousands of bodies in piles where people had jumped seeking refuge and had drowned or suffocated when others landed on top of them. The disposal of the bodies became a massive logistical challenge for Tokyo authorities, who lacked the resources and infrastructure to handle casualties on such scale. Improvised cremation sites were established where bodies were burned in mass pyres, ashes and bone fragments later buried in mass graves, because individual identification was impossible for most victims. Families searching for missing relatives often had no way to determine whether loved ones had survived or died, an uncertainty that would persist for weeks or months until survivors could be located, or until it became clear through absence that they had died in the fires. The psychological trauma of not knowing whether family members were alive or dead compounded the trauma of surviving the attack itself. The impact on Tokyo's civilian population went far beyond the immediate casualties and destruction. The survivors, approximately 1 million people who had lost their homes and all possessions, became refugees needing shelter, food, and basic necessities in a city whose infrastructure was already strained by wartime shortages and by damage from previous bombing raids. The Japanese government and Tokyo municipal authorities established temporary shelters in buildings that had survived the fires, in schools, in temples and shrines, and in any available space, but these facilities were grossly inadequate for the numbers needing assistance. Food supplies were stretched even thinner, as rations had to feed refugees who had lost everything, including whatever food stocks they had maintained at home. The psychological impact on Tokyo residents who survived extended throughout the population, including those in areas that had not been directly affected by the March 10th raid. If fires could consume 16 square miles of the city in a single night, killing 100,000 people, then no neighborhood was safe, and no amount of civil defense preparation could provide protection against future attacks of similar scale. The belief that it sustained civilian morale through previous years of the war, the conviction that somehow Japan would prevail and that sacrifices would be rewarded with eventual victory, began eroding as people recognized that American bombing would continue and intensify until either Japan surrendered or until the entire country was destroyed. The March 10th raid on Tokyo was followed by similar incendiary attacks on other major Japanese cities over the following months, a systematic campaign to destroy urban areas throughout Japan using the tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective against Tokyo. Nagoya was attacked on March 12th with similar results, though smaller scale given that city's lesser size and population density. Osaka was attacked on March 13th and 14th, suffering extensive damage and heavy casualties. Kobe was attacked on March 16th and 17th. By the end of March 1945, American B-29s had destroyed large portions of Japan's 4 largest cities, killing tens of thousands of civilians and rendering millions homeless, demonstrating that the March 10th Tokyo attack was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a systematic campaign to destroy Japan's urban areas. The strategic rationale for the firebombing campaign was that destroying Japanese cities would eliminate the small workshops and home industries that produced significant portions of Japanese war material. Japanese war production was much more dispersed than American or German production, with many components manufactured in small facilities scattered throughout residential neighborhoods rather than concentrated in large factories. American intelligence believed, probably correctly, that destroying residential areas would also destroy much of this dispersed industrial capacity and would kill workers whose labor was essential to war production. The additional effect of breaking civilian morale and creating pressure on the Japanese government to surrender was welcomed, but was considered secondary to the goal of destroying war production capacity. The moral and legal questions about the firebombing campaign were raised during the war and have continued generating debate in the decades since. The intentional targeting of civilian population centers for destruction violated traditional interpretations of international law regarding warfare and the principle of distinction between combatants and civilians. The defense offered by American authorities was that Japanese cities contained significant war production facilities and that the dispersed nature of Japanese industry made it impossible to attack military targets without affecting surrounding residential areas. This justification was technically accurate, but did not fully address the question of whether attacks designed primarily to destroy residential areas and to kill civilians could be justified by the presence of some military-relevant production. The alternative view, held by some observers during the war and by many historians afterward, was that the firebombing campaign constituted war crimes that happened to be committed by the winning side and that were therefore never prosecuted. This perspective argues that deliberately killing civilians through methods designed to maximize casualties cannot be justified by military necessity, and that the firebombing campaign, particularly the Tokyo raid that killed 100,000 civilians in a single night, crossed moral lines that should not be crossed regardless of strategic circumstances. The debate has never been resolved and reflects fundamental disagreements about what methods are permissible in warfare and about whether victory justifies any means employed to achieve it. The comparison between the Tokyo firebombing and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 months later raises additional questions about why the atomic attacks received far more attention and generated more moral questioning, despite killing fewer people than the Tokyo raid. The most obvious answer is that atomic weapons represented a fundamentally new technology with implications extending far beyond their immediate destructive effects, while incendiary bombing was simply a more effective application of existing technology. The psychological impact of a single bomb destroying an entire city differed from the impact of hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of bombs, even if the end result was similar destruction and similar casualties. The Japanese government's response to the firebombing campaign was constrained by limited resources and by the recognition that Japan lacked effective defenses against high-altitude B-29 attacks or against the low-altitude nighttime raids that began with the Tokyo attack. Japanese fighter forces had been decimated during previous campaigns and lacked sufficient numbers or performance to effectively counter B-29 raids. Anti-aircraft artillery was inadequate in quantity and capability, Unable to reach B-29s flying at high altitude and ineffective against low-altitude nighttime attacks where targets were difficult to identify and track. The most effective Japanese response was to evacuate non-essential civilians from major cities to rural areas, reducing the number of people exposed to bombing, but also disrupting war production by removing workers from factories. The evacuation programs implemented after March 10th moved millions of Japanese civilians from cities to rural areas where they lived with relatives or in improvised housing, straining rural resources and creating hardships for both evacuees and host communities. Children were separated from parents and sent to countryside locations where schools had been relocated, a traumatic experience for families that was justified by the necessity of protecting children from bombing. The elderly and infirm often remained in cities because they could not be easily moved, creating a demographic shift where urban populations became increasingly elderly and less able to contribute to war production or to civil defense efforts. The impact of the firebombing campaign on Japanese war production was significant, though difficult to quantify precisely because Japanese record-keeping deteriorated during 1945 and because production facilities were so dispersed that tracking losses was challenging. American estimates suggested that the bombing reduced Japanese war production by approximately 50% during the final months of the war. Though, how much of this reduction resulted from bombing versus from other factors like raw material shortages, transportation disruptions, and labor shortages is difficult to determine. What is clear is that by August 1945, when the atomic bombs were dropped and when Japan surrendered, Japanese industrial production had been severely degraded, and Japanese cities had been substantially destroyed through the combined effects of the firebombing campaign. The human cost of the firebombing campaign across all Japanese cities totaled approximately 330,000 civilians killed and millions rendered homeless, casualties that exceeded Japanese military deaths during the final year of the war, and that represented approximately 1% of Japan's total population. The concentration of casualties in urban areas meant that certain cities and certain neighborhoods suffered devastation approaching what European cities had experienced during World War I, or what would later be experienced in conflicts like Vietnam or Iraq, where civilian populations bore enormous costs from sustained bombing campaigns. The intergenerational trauma from these experiences affected Japanese society for decades afterward and influenced post-war Japanese attitudes toward war and toward the use of military force. The American aircrew who flew the firebombing missions experienced their own psychological challenges from participating in operations that were clearly killing enormous numbers of civilians. B-29 crews could see the fires they started, could smell the smoke from burning cities, and understood intellectually, even if they didn't dwell on it emotionally, that their bombs were killing people below. Some crew members later expressed guilt or regret about their participation in the campaign, questioning whether the destruction they helped create was necessary or justified. Others maintained that they were following orders and that responsibility for decisions about targeting and tactics rested with commanders rather than with individual aircrew who executed the missions. The long-term effects of the firebombing campaign on Japanese urban development and on attitudes toward civil defense and disaster preparedness were profound and continue influencing Japanese policy and planning decades after the war ended. The rebuilding of destroyed cities provided opportunities to create more modern urban layouts with wider streets, better fire prevention measures, and improved infrastructure compared to the densely packed neighborhoods that had burned so easily in 1945. modern Japanese building codes emphasize fire resistance and earthquake survivability, reflecting lessons learned from both wartime firebombing and from natural disasters like earthquakes that periodically strike Japanese cities. The firebombing campaign demonstrated the vulnerability of cities to aerial attack and the limitations of civil defense measures when confronted with attacks exceeding the scale and intensity that defensive preparations anticipated. These lessons influenced Cold War thinking about nuclear warfare and about the futility of civil defense measures against nuclear weapons that would create effects similar to the Tokyo firestorm, but concentrated in single explosions. The recognition that modern warfare could destroy entire cities in hours or minutes fundamentally changed strategic thinking about warfare and about what constraints should exist on military operations in conflicts involving major powers. The commemoration of the Tokyo firebombing and of the other Japanese cities that were destroyed has been complicated in Japan by nationalist elements that emphasize Japanese victimization while minimizing Japanese aggression that led to the war, and by progressive elements that use the firebombing as evidence of American war crimes and of the need for pacifism. The anniversary of March 10th is marked in Tokyo with ceremonies remembering the victims and with exhibitions showing photographs and artifacts from the attack. But the commemoration lacks the prominence that Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings receive, despite the Tokyo raid killing more people than either atomic attack. American commemoration of the firebombing campaign is even less prominent, with the March 10th raid receiving minimal attention in American historical memory compared to events like D-Day or Iwo Jima, despite the Tokyo raid being the single most destructive air attack in history. The lack of American attention reflects discomfort with aspects of the campaign that conflict with preferred narratives about American conduct during World War II, and reflects the general American tendency to remember military victories and technological achievements while minimizing attention to operations that raise moral questions about methods employed to achieve victory. General Curtis LeMay, who ordered the firebombing campaign and who later became Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, never expressed regret about the Tokyo raid or about the broader firebombing campaign. He maintained throughout his life that the attacks were militarily necessary to end the war and that the casualties inflicted on Japanese civilians were unfortunate, but justified by the strategic objective of forcing Japanese surrender without requiring an invasion that would have killed millions of Japanese and hundreds of thousands of Americans. LeMay's perspective reflected the utilitarian calculation that killing 100,000 civilians in a single night was acceptable if doing so saved more lives ultimately by ending the war sooner than would otherwise have occurred. The counter-argument to LeMay's position is that military necessity cannot justify any action regardless of its effects on civilians, and that certain methods, including deliberately creating firestorms designed to kill civilians, should be prohibited regardless of strategic circumstances. This perspective holds that LeMay and other commanders who ordered and executed the firebombing campaign bore moral responsibility for war crimes even if they were never prosecuted, because they were on the winning side. The debate between these positions continues without resolution, because it reflects fundamental disagreements about ethics in warfare that cannot be settled through logical argument or through appeals to historical precedent. The technical lessons from the firebombing campaign influenced post-war Air Force doctrine about strategic bombing and about the most effective methods for destroying urban targets. The effectiveness of incendiary weapons against wood and paper construction was noted and incorporated into planning for potential future conflicts, Though the development of nuclear weapons largely superseded conventional strategic bombing as the primary method for destroying cities in any future major war. The tactics developed during the campaign, including low-altitude night attacks, the use of Pathfinder aircraft to mark targets, and the stream formation, where aircraft attacked individually rather than in defensive formations, all influenced subsequent Air Force operations and training. The civilian survivors of the Tokyo firebombing carried physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives, trauma that affected their families and that was passed down in various forms to subsequent generations who grew up hearing stories about the night when fire consumed a quarter of Tokyo and killed 100,000 people. The survivors' accounts provide the most powerful testimony about what the firebombing meant at human scale, how people experienced the terror of being trapped by fires, advancing faster than they could run, how families were separated in the chaos and sometimes never reunited, how the smell and the heat and the screaming created memories that never faded despite decades passing. The children who survived often lost parents or siblings or entire families in the fires, leaving them orphaned or with fractured families that struggled to rebuild after the war. The psychological impact of these losses, combined with the general trauma of living through sustained bombing and through the war's final desperate months, created a generation of Japanese who approached adulthood with experiences that shaped their worldviews profoundly. Many became dedicated pacifists who opposed any military action and who worked throughout their lives to prevent Japan from returning to militarism. Others became focused on rebuilding and economic development, channeling their energies into creating prosperity that would ensure their children never experienced the kind of destruction they had survived. The March 10, 1945, firebombing of Tokyo stands as one of the most destructive and deadly single events of World War II, killing more people in one night than any other air attack before or since, including the atomic bombings that followed 5 months later. The operation demonstrated the destructive potential of strategic bombing when applied systematically against vulnerable targets using appropriate weapons and tactics. It raised moral questions about the methods employed in warfare and about whether military necessity can justify any action regardless of its effects on civilians. It showed the limitations of civil defense measures against attacks that exceed the scale and intensity that defensive preparations anticipated. And it provided bitter evidence that modern warfare had become total war, where distinction between combatants and civilians had largely disappeared and where entire populations became targets in conflicts between industrial nations fighting for survival.